As this is a slightly shorter video, I just want to pop in at the beginning here to plug my Patreon. All these other YouTubers are trying for big money before they make YouTube a full-time job. I just need about $500 per month to make this viable, which will give me more time for a lot more content. I have an endless stream of ideas and I just need the time to produce them, and for that I need a small contribution. So far, my existence is being upheld by Aaron, Alex, Jonathan, and Megaminer333, and I love them for it. If you want to join in the fight for objective truth, please consider supporting me through Patreon if it is possible, or at the very least, subscribe, like, and or comment to support me within YouTube's algorithm. If you have been paying attention to the content of the first 6 videos in the Spiral Hypothesis of Teaching playlist, you may have spotted the fact that for a channel that states it is producing videos based on the philosophy of objectivism, we have talked a lot more about the specialized sciences and not much about what Ayn Rand produced in her fiction and non-fiction. So today, I will tie the philosophy of objectivism to the sciences. So far, we have mostly explored the sense of sight and the physics of light. Therefore, we will stay mostly in the realm of vision, and what the philosophy has to say in regard to this sense. In this way, we can test if objectivism, and by extension all other philosophies, conform to reality. In Chapter 1 of Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, Ayn Rand lays out the development of man's mind in regard to the implicit concept of existent. The first stage is a child's awareness of objects, of things, which represents the implicit concept entity. The second and closely allied stage is the awareness of specific, particular things which he can recognize and distinguish from the rest of his perceptual field, which represents the implicit concept identity. The third stage consists of grasping relationships among these entities by grasping the similarities and differences of their identities. This requires the transformation of the implicit entity into the implicit concept unit. She follows this up with a succinct description. The ability to regard entities as units is man's distinctive method of cognition. And for our knowledge, she describes the concept of unit. Units are things viewed by a consciousness in certain existing relationships. To top this all off, it is important to know that the essence of objectivism is the supremacy of reason. This means that Ayn Rand's contributions to politics, ethics, and art is because of her philosophy of epistemology. It is by understanding what man is and what makes man different from the other animals that man can determine what he ought to do about his life. That is the purpose of philosophy. Philosophy, understood properly, is a guide for everyday living, and understanding what the supremacy of reason means will guide you through all of the remaining philosophical subjects. First, let's analyze what is meant by the supremacy of reason, and then we will look at the development of reason from senses to percepts to concepts. The supremacy of reason means that reason is supreme, but compared to what? What else is there? Man has senses, man has emotions, and man thinks about what he senses and thinks about how it makes him feel. The supremacy of reason is the idea that what man senses is real, and to gain knowledge he must learn about these objects he is sensing with a method of non-contradictory identification. The supremacy of emotion would be the idea that man can somehow acquire knowledge from his emotions without the senses that cause the emotions. The only other possible alternative would be the idea that regardless of what pathway to knowledge you take, you cannot know anything because reality isn't real or knowable in our condition. In short, the alternatives to reason are forms of mysticism or skepticism. This is what is meant by the supremacy of reason. Man gains knowledge about the world from reality, as detected by his conscious senses, and the emotions that follow do not provide knowledge of reality, just how he feels about that aspect of reality. We can dismiss the skeptics in the same way they dismiss reality, without any evidence. The skeptic claim that they cannot know anything about reality is contradicted by their ability to formulate an argument about reality. They need to invoke and rely on their ability to perceive and remember concepts tied to concrete objects in order to say that what they perceive is not real. It does not matter if we are in a computer simulation. What we sense is our reality, and if you were in a computer, you would be able to discover it through physics, and maybe even use the computer data to learn about the reality outside the computer. Existence exists, regardless of how it exists. Emotions are not capable of grasping reality, and in fact tend to cause people to become irrational and lose touch of reality. It is not possible to start with emotions and then use that information to reason a solution. In order to experience emotion, a consciousness must think of or about something that they can sense first, and then an automatic response to that thought is formed based on the man's value system. An emotion only tells you that you feel something about something. Faith, as a means of acquiring knowledge, falls somewhere in between skepticism and emotions. To man, it is being skeptical of whether he is capable of knowing, which drives the emotion of inferiority, which leads him to using his senses to acquire knowledge gained from other people. His emotions tell him that others are capable of knowing, but he is not. This means of acquiring knowledge requires that he believe that the law of identity is not a law of reality at all, and that A can be non-A if a superior being, which cannot be sensed but only emotionally known, is reported to have said it is true. Therefore, all that is left to man in acquiring knowledge is his senses. You cannot even invent any of these false ways of knowing without first acquiring sensory data, perceiving entities, and conceptualizing meaning about them. Every argument that denounces the supremacy of reason requires its supremacy in order to form a series of statements that is believed to make logical sense as to why reason and logic are inferior. Man's capacity to reason begins with the senses, where individual pieces of energy from the universe interact with the energy receptors in his body. This first stage is a chaotic, knowledgeless existence. In order to perceive objects visually, the individual sensations of the rods and cones must work together. As seen in my last video, each rod and cone releases glutamate when it is on, and therefore your first visual experience to a line will stimulate a line of rods and cones. The receptive fields will automatically work, which will send a signal to the brain that says this line of rods and cones was on. As the newborn looks around, this pattern of lines will continue to be observed over and over and over for years before anyone points to it and says to the child, "This is called a line." The brain is very good at detecting patterns, because patterns exist in reality, and the method of acquiring the ability to perceive is done automatically by cells activating together. Before the child has even fully developed his sense of sight, the larger receptive fields have already taken in patterns such as lines, corners, curves, and illuminants. As the eyes develop, patterns of depth and color and more are added to the pattern recognition. The brain automatically receives the information from each individual sensation. But that is not enough to acquire knowledge. If only one photon bounces off an object and hits your eye, the eye can sense it, and it will cause one of the millions of opsin to activate, and some of the gates in that cell will close. But overall, the cell will not really notice the change, and no action potentials will be sent. To stimulate the rod such that it will depolarize requires a visible dot of light, which will activate a group of sensation receptors. All perceptual animals require knowledge as a means of surviving. Cats and dogs don't chase undifferentiated sensations. They chase objects that they perceive. They can remember what the object looks like and even associate it with a name or gesture. Every animal must use their integrated senses to perceive, and that perception is what is retained in the brain. That which is retained in the brain due to experience with the outside world through the senses is knowledge. Knowledge, at its lowest level, is just a mental grasp of the fact of reality at the perceptual level. It cannot provide infallible truths. Truth is a product of the identification of the facts of reality. And this identification cannot have contradictions. A contradictory truth is not a truth. It is possible to know two contradictory ideas at the same time, but it is not possible that both pieces of knowledge are true. Therefore, man needs a method of acquiring a non-contradictory truth so as to acquire a higher level of knowledge. This method is called logic. Logic is the art of non-contradictory identification. All truths are the product of a logical identification of the facts of experience. Logic, at its lowest and most implicit, is based on objective cause and effect experience. It would be inaccurate to state that higher-level perceptual animals perform logic qua logic. Logic requires the conceptual level, which we have not yet reached. However, logic has one law, the law of identity, and therefore all animal knowledge based on cause and effect provides the animal with a rudimentary, unverifiable, and incomplete method similar to logic. For example, a crow can perceive a worm floating in a glass of water, which it cannot reach, and can perceive rocks around the glass. The crow knows implicitly that A, he cannot reach the worm, B, the worm floats, and C, the rocks make the water level go up. Let's assume he has never done this task before, and that he doesn't know that C, that the rocks will increase the water level. How would he come to know that? Perhaps he grabs a rock and tries to reach the worm, but drops the rock in the water. It is a perceivable fact that the water went higher, and so did the worm. And it is closer to reach now. The crow can use its retained knowledge to do it again, and again, until the worm is reachable. Watching a crow do this activity seems like they are employing logic, which in a sense they are, but it is not logic. Not in the same way we use logic. The crow can solve the puzzle, but will never understand why the water level rises. This is the case with most people these days. The conceptual level of consciousness is not an automatic process. It must be done actively. Most people today live as perceptual animals and not conceptual animals. For instance, what does it mean to be progressive? What does it mean to be conservative? These words have no definition to the people that subscribe to these titles. It is a sound that is a symbol for something that feels good. But as we have already gone over, emotions are not a means to truth. In order to reach the conceptual level, man must have concepts, and concepts are not just sounds that act as a symbol. A concept requires a definition that specifies the relationship of two or more units, while omitting particular measurements. Units are things viewed by a consciousness in certain existing relationships. What is the difference between an entity and a unit? How does this transformation occur? An entity is a thing that exists in reality. A solely perceptual consciousness can observe an entity, but it cannot perceive that entity as a unit. A unit can be that same existent, but it is regarded as separate from the other existence similar to it. For example, to my dog, this ball exists, and it is different from this ball. This is something she knows. But what she does not know is that this ball can be regarded as a ball. This unit formation is what allows for concepts in mathematics. It is easier to see the use of units in math, where instead of remembering every number as a distinct concrete, we assign a unit. If we have 5 sticks, my dog will identify all the objects individually, and they will all smell different and look different. If she were to assign names to concepts, she would assign a different name to every stick because no one stick represents the group if you cannot omit the differences and cannot identify similar units. The unit, the relationship between existents, is used as a symbol to represent the set, but the process of forming a concept is not complete until you abstract out, separate, take out the similar but different attributes. When you omit the specific differences in the unit that represent the set, you get a concept. For instance, Aristotle and the philosophers of his time were arguing what makes a tree a tree. To a perceptual animal like my dog, each tree is an individual. But to humans, we know each tree entity is a tree. The symbol is the word tree, and if we pick one at random, it will have all of the features that define a tree. However, they all fulfill that definition in different measures. By looking at any random tree, you can abstract out that a tree has leaves, regardless of whether they are needles or fans. They all have bark, regardless of the measure of its thickness, color, texture, etc. and that every tree has branches, regardless of its measure of quantity, shape, and complexity. The units are the relationships between the existents. The concept is the integration of those units while omitting their specifics. The ability to transform entities into units is man's distinctive method of cognition. This leads to concept formation. The first implicit concepts an infant learns are concrete attributes like length, although conceptually it will be one of the last things he learns. The concept length comes from observing entities. The observation comes from light reflecting off objects and hitting a connected path of rods, which activates the receptive fields, which informs the brain that the eyes have seen something, which activates these amount of nerves in a particular way. The brain retains that information and recalls it every time it sees it again. Over time, the brain will have a region dedicated to perceiving lines, which are seen in the cortical module. The human brain can also have a part of the brain that collects sounds in the same way. And when you are growing up, your caretakers give you the sound and the image together, which strengthens the connection between things of a perceived length and its name. If you gave an infant a match, a pencil, and a stick, you could teach them that the match is called match, and that the pencil is called pencil, and that the stick is called Jim. And when you ask the infant for Jim, they can find it. If you were to replace the stick for a different stick, the infant would not be able to find Jim, because Jim is a particular stick. This is true for the pencil and the match too, as they are just names to the infant. But once the child has reached the stage where any stick can be Jim, because any stick can represent the set, or any pencil can be used when they are asked for a pencil, can you ask the child to attempt to identify attributes the match, the pencil, and the stick share? If the child is capable of making one of the objects a unit that represents the rest, he can, for example, grab the match and say, "This one is like the others because it looks like the others." You could then ask them, "In which way does it look the same? They are different colors. They have different parts. How do they look the same?" The child would then say something along the lines of, "They all go this way but not this way, but those are bigger in that way than the match." Comparing objects in this way requires that you abstract out features which are observable to the senses in order to better understand the world around you. The process of concept formation as a means of coming to know reality requires sensory data about the world around you. Once you are able to form and use concepts, you can then use a method of non-contradictory identification as a means of validating the perceptual knowledge you have automatically obtained over the years. Logic is man's method of reaching conclusions objectively by deriving them without contradiction from the facts of reality, ultimately from the evidence provided by man's senses. The application of logic is what allows man to produce, and that production is what allows man to survive. This is the full meaning of the supremacy of reason. Without the supremacy of reason as an ideal, man is forced to choose between an ideology where only an invisible non-entity can tell you what is true, or an ideology that states that nothing you know can ever be true. By knowing what man is, by knowing how man receives sensational data, can we conclude that man's survival and success is based on the level to which he apply and prioritize reason. Objectivity is the recognition of the fact that a man's consciousness must acquire knowledge of reality by reason in accordance with logic. And if one recognizes the supremacy of reason and applies it consistently, all the rest follows.